Corporate governance, conflicts, mechanisms, and risks and benefits. So, as the name of this learning module states, we're going to be talking about what are the conflicts that happen among stakeholders, of which, of course, shareholders are the first ones, and then you've got your creditors, management, employees, customers, suppliers, and so on and so forth. How do we manage those conflicts? What is the role of corporate governance in balancing the interests of all these stakeholders, and what are its mechanisms for maintaining that balance? And then finally, what are the risks of having corporate governance mechanisms and what are the benefits? So, as discussed, we're going to be talking about the conflict that has a natural position between these stakeholders, and the reason for that is something called a principal agent problem. Of course, there are other reasons as well, which we will be discussing, but the main core one is principal agent problem, which we will talk about. Then we will move on to discuss how the mechanisms of corporate governance can help us manage these conflicts and help maintain healthy relationships between all stakeholders. And then finally, we will talk about the risks and the benefits of these corporate governance mechanisms and how we can avoid having poor ones, and rather than poor, we can focus on having effective corporate governance mechanisms in place. So this is an exhibit you've seen earlier, that you have your shareholders that provide equity to the firm, you have your creditors that provide debt, and these two are capital providers. They both provide capital. And then the shareholders, of course, appoint board of directors through their voting rights, who then appoint managers. And these managers also hire employees who deal with customers and suppliers to carry out the day-to-day business, and then deal with the government for both regulatory compliance and submission of tax revenues. Now, what we really want to focus on first is the principal agent problem, where your shareholders are the principal and the board of directors and then subsequently their managers are the agents. Now, a principal agent problem occurs when the interest of the agent is different than that of the principal. Maybe a manager wants a higher bonus or maybe a higher fixed salary, right? So managers might be interested in a higher salary, and obviously if the salary will be higher, then the profit will be lower. So that conflicts with the shareholders' interest of higher profit. And that brings us to the principal agent problem, where a principal hires an agent to carry out a task or service. And here the principal that we are talking about is shareholders, and the agent that we are talking about is your managers and directors. So first they hire your board of directors, who then obviously appoint the CEO and CFO, which is the management. Of course, the agent is obliged to act in the best interest of the principal, and ideally they should not have a conflict of interest in doing this. But the reality is different. And why? One of the main reasons is something called information asymmetry. Now, symmetry means equal. Like, for example, if you have a symmetrical triangle, it is equal on both sides. So that is where this word is coming from. Asymmetry means unequal, and information asymmetry means that unequal information is there. So managers, because they are running the day-to-day business, they definitely will have more or greater access to information about a company's performance as compared to their principals, which are the providers of equity, the shareholders, and even the providers of debt, which is your creditors. And why is that a problem? Because unless the shareholders know what's going on, they cannot get rid of the poor performers. They cannot vote out the poor performers. It's very important that the manager's true performance should be known to the principal. And if that is not going to happen, then naturally it's going to be difficult for the shareholders and even the creditors to vote out the poor performers. Now, is this there equally? And when I say this, I'm talking about information asymmetry. Is this there equally in all types of companies? Well, it is usually higher in very complicated businesses, in high tech, let's say, usually higher in complex businesses. These days, you've got these high tech businesses with very, very complicated products, and not all shareholders are able to understand what's going on inside the company, and the management is usually much more capable at that particular tech business, so they are able to actually not give a true picture to the shareholders. So the more complicated the business, the more information asymmetry, the greater the information asymmetry, the higher the risk premium will be for investing in that business, and the higher the return the investors will demand from that company, because they just don't know what's going on inside. So that's why they're going to ask for a higher risk premium for investing in these type of companies. So anyways, we're going to look at various examples of these conflicts going forward in this learning module. We're going to look at three different perspectives, starting first with the shareholder versus the manager director relationship, which is the principal agent relationship that we've been talking about. And before I jump deeper into the shareholder and manager director relationships, let me just give you a higher level discussion that we are also going to talk about next, which is going to be 2.2 after this 2.1, is large or majority shareholders versus minority shareholders, right? So that is also something that could create a certain conflict of interest. That will be 2.2. And 2.3 is going to be providers of equity, which are your shareholders, right, versus providers of debt, which could be your banks or your bondholders, right? So we're going to look at the conflicts in these two as well. But first, let's focus a little bit more on the shareholder versus manager director relationship, or the principal agent relationship that we have been talking about. Now, again, in theory, this problem is solved with a delicate balance of compensation. Now, what does that mean? See, if you're going to give a fixed salary to your management, they're not really going to be motivated to improving or increasing the profit of a business. And obviously, shareholders want higher profits. So if shareholder wants to align, if the shareholder, who are the principals, they want to align the interest with the managers and directors, it is very important to give them variable compensation in the form of stock grants or stock options, which means, let's say the current stock price of the company is 50. You tell the CEO and his team that we will give you stock options or the right to buy the company's stock at 60, and then the management works very hard to take the stock from 50 to 80 so they can buy at 60 and sell at 80. So you have to incentivize them to be able to motivate them to maximize shareholder value, or to be specific, the share price. Now, does this work perfectly? The answer is no. In practice, this is rarely perfect, and there are a lot of examples which create conflict, and we are going to tell you about them on the next slide. Starting with, well, the next two slides, because I just wanted to give more focus on each of these points instead of stuffing all that information in one slide. So let's look at each one of them very, very slowly and carefully. First of all is insufficient effort. Now, obviously, we're not giving 100% variable compensation to the management. We're going to still be giving them a certain amount of fixed salary. Now, they might be content with that fixed salary, and they might then devote insufficient time to their duties. They may conduct too little monitoring of the employees, who are of course their junior employees, and they might assert too little control, right? And again, if, for example, their fixed salaries are large, so if you have large fixed salaries, then they might not be interested in taking any risk at all. They might avoid risks just to make sure that nothing big goes wrong, and they can just continue to take these large fixed salaries. If you give them compensation, variable compensation, not tied to the profit, but instead of the profit, if you tie it to the size of the company, like for example, the top line, which is your revenue, right? Then they might just go for growth just for growth's sake. I mean, they might go for new business lines, they might acquire other companies, even though it might not be that profitable to do so, but they will do it because their compensation is tied to the size of the company, not to the amount of profit they are earning for the shareholders. And this is known as empire building. Now, the other 2 points: excessive risk taking. Again, if you give them compensation which is more inclined towards, rather heavily relies on stock grants and options and not that much fixed, so then they might take excessive risk. So therefore, I had used the word delicate balance. This alignment of your manager-director relationships with shareholders is done through compensation, but it has to be done in a very delicate manner where that balance between fixed compensation and variable compensation has to be very, very delicately managed. And then lastly, self-dealing, where you have these senior managers using company resources like private planes, club memberships, etc., personal security to just personally benefit. And this, of course, eventually leads to further complications where they might even misappropriate company assets. Now, how do you solve this? Apart from your delicate compensation balance requirement, there are some other things that we can do as shareholders from a corporate governance perspective, is that we can have monitoring of these agents, and we can have some other assurance initiatives in place where we kind of make them sign bonds and such legal protections in place. So all of this will obviously increase our cost, and that is called agency cost. So to solve the conflict of interest, which is in the principal agent problem, we have certain initiatives we can take, but those initiatives don't come for free. There's a cost associated with them, and that is what we call agency cost. And this is valid for all large public companies and even large private companies, because the ownership is separated from the operation, and since the management is non-owners, therefore there will be a certain cost of monitoring them and making sure that they are operating in the best interest of the principals. And these are the two main agency costs that we're going to be looking at. One is to monitor the management, right? So of course there's annual reports, board of directors meetings, expenses to keep an eye on the management. And then secondly, costs of assurance, such as you might have non-compete employment contracts that the management is not going to go and join the competitor or disclose confidential information. There might be certain insurance that might be there to guarantee performance. Think of signing bonds and similar things. So all of this obviously is going to increase the cost. If you can align the compensation, then hopefully you don't need that much monitoring and assurance, because then the management is just naturally more inclined towards performing in the interest of the shareholders because their interests are aligned. Now moving on to 2.2, which is the conflict between major or controlling shareholders and minor shareholders. So you can have two types of ownership structures. One is dispersed, where you have a lot of small shareholders and none of them are actually having majority ownership, or even more importantly, majority control, because it's not the ownership that is the problem here, it is the control. And you will find various cases where you have these huge shareholders, but they are not really asserting their control, and you will find very small shareholders, even 20-30%, much less than 50%, but they are able to assert their control. That is where the problem can begin between major controlling shareholders and minority, where you have this concentrated individual or group that has the ability to exercise control over the company. And why is this a problem? Because of two different types of conflicts that may arise. First of all, let's say you have Mark Zuckerberg, right? Just an example for academic discussion. Now, Mark Zuckerberg, is the owner of Facebook, or now it is called Meta. Now, let's say all his money is in Facebook. So, he would want Facebook or Meta to diversify its business because he wants his wealth to be diversified. Now, as a minority shareholder, if you have some of your investment in Meta and you can put the rest in 100 other companies, so you wouldn't want Meta to diversify. Rather, you would want Meta to focus on their core business, which could be whatever, social media, right? And then you can diversify on your own very cheaply by buying other assets. But for Mark Zuckerberg, obviously, he will want to diversify within the company because that is where his wealth is. Number one. Number two, he might have a multi-decade perspective, and you might have a relatively shorter perspective where you might be looking for a quick gain. And this is something which is very valid for Amazon and Jeff Bezos, because over the years, Jeff Bezos apparently, was always having a long-term perspective. Of course, it's worked out fantastically in the long run, but a lot of his early investors probably wanted their returns much earlier, much faster. So these are two reasons why there could be a conflict between the major shareholder and the minority shareholder. Now, what is a majority shareholder? More than 50%. What is a minority shareholder? Less than 50%. But even in the cases of minority shareholders, you can have a situation where they are controlling. And a very good example of that is Mark Zuckerberg with his Facebook or Meta shares, right? Why? Because there is a dual class structure. So Facebook or Meta has two different shares, and Mark Zuckerberg has one of those classes of shares, and the rest of the investors have the other class. And what is interesting about Mark's shares is that he has 10 times the number of votes to all the other classes. So even if Mark's ownership has fallen below 50%, right, or let's say it's fallen to 10%, but because he still has 10 times more voting, 10x more voting than the other 90%, so still he's going to have the same amount of voting power, because each of his shares is having 10 votes, whereas the other shares are having 1 vote each. So this is a way in which, even though his ownership level is going down, he is still able to assert his control over the company. And naturally, this is not a good thing from a corporate governance perspective, and also not a good thing from the perspective of minority shareholders. Right, now moving to point number 2.3, which is the conflict between your shareholders and your creditors or debt providers, so between equity and debt providers. And this is something we have discussed before, that your debt providers want stable cash flows so that they can get their money back, whereas your equity providers want profits and higher profits because they share in the upside. Your debt providers do not share in the upside, because even though the loss is same for both, but the profit is unlimited for the equity providers, whereas the profit for your debt providers is limited. So the better the performance of the company, the higher the return the shareholders or equity providers can get, whereas your creditors have a limited upside, so they would like to be conservative and they would like to have a stable cash flow, which means shareholders want higher risk, whereas your creditors will want a lower risk. Number one. Number two, whatever cash is coming, creditors would want you to pay the interest and keep that money to pay the principal back, whereas shareholders will want dividends. So there is that conflict there as well. And then, of course, shareholders could say that, okay, let us take more loans, let us increase the borrowing and pay dividends to ourselves, which will not be a good thing from the perspective of existing debt holders, because they will say that, okay, you're taking on more debt, which means the company's cash flow is going to get stuck even more, and they might not be able to, the original creditors might not be able to get their money back. All right, so we're going to stop this video here, and in the next one, we're going to pick up with what are the mechanisms of corporate governance that can be used to solve some of these issues.
Hey, he just tell glass, no plastic. Okay. ஃப்ளாஸ்க்கும் பிளாஸ்டிக்கும் வித்தியாசம் இருக்கு. ஒரு சத்தம் மாதிரி கேக்குதா? A cup of glass, it's a plastic. என்ன நினைச்சீங்க? இந்த வேலை எங்க? ஆமா. இந்த மூணு இதெல்லாம் பண்ணிருக்காத. ஓ ஆமாடே, நம்ம எடுத்துட்டு போனோம்.